Hi, everyone. Good afternoon already over there in New York, early evening here in Israel. I'm joining you today from my home in Kibbutz Nachal Oz. It's a kibbutz in southern Israel, very, very close to the border with Gaza. And today I will speak for about 30, maybe 30 and a bit minutes about the current situation in Israel, where we stand today regarding the Netanyahu government's plan to change the balance of power between the authorities in Israel and in general, the current political moment in the country. And after my, again, 30-ish minutes presentation, I would love to also get questions from the audience. I know these are challenging and sometimes confusing times for people in the diaspora who are trying to follow what's happening here in Israel. And so everyone is welcome to, as Oz just wrote, to send questions via the chat. And I think this session, I hope it is also being recorded, so you can also maybe share it later with friends and family who are expressing interest in the current drama here. So what is happening in Israel? Always an interesting question, but these days especially. We just marked 2 days ago 4 months to the formation of Benjamin Netanyahu's current government, a government that was formed after an election that took place in November, half a year ago. And that was, if you recall, the 5th Israeli election in 4 years, which by itself is a sign of a political crisis. I mean, we in Israel love to take pride in the fact that we are the only democracy in the Middle East. But I think even for the only democracy in the Middle East, 5 elections in 4 years may be just a little too much. And 4 of those 5 elections were deadlocked. Nobody won a clear majority. And after one of those elections, Netanyahu lost power for a year and a half, then when we had Israel's government of change, led by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid. And when their government collapsed, we went to a new election that gave us the current Netanyahu coalition. This was the first election in 4 years that did not end in a deadlock. It ended in a clear majority for one side, the side of the religious, nationalistic parties that support Netanyahu. Basically, his Likud party and all of Israel's religious parties, all the way to the far right. They won 64 seats. In Israel, that is usually a stable majority, although I'm not sure how stable this government is. We can address that later. I'll just say, very briefly, this majority is also a bit misleading, because if you look at the raw vote numbers, actually Netanyahu and all the religious parties did not win a majority of the vote. They won just over 49%. But because of very bad tactical arrangements on behalf of the Israeli left wing, parties on the left that should have merged and run together decided to split and run separately, and then 2 parties on the left did not pass Israel's electoral threshold, the bare minimum amount of votes that is required for any representation in our parliament, in the Knesset. And once that happened, it not only ensured Netanyahu's victory, but also inflated his majority. And so his government came into office with a clear majority 4 months ago, but also with a lot of concerns around it. I'll try to explain it with a personal story. A few years ago, when I was still living in the United States, I was invited to speak at a modern Orthodox, right-wing leaning, conservative-leaning synagogue in the New York area. And when I came to speak at that synagogue, I knew that I was coming there as a journalist for Haaretz, and that the people who are going to listen to me have a certain image of who I am and what my opinions are and where I stand on some issues. And it was very important to me when I started that lecture in that right-leaning, more Orthodox synagogue to give them the real impression of who I am, and to make it clear to the crowd that some of what they think about me may be true and some of what they think about me may not be true, and maybe the devil isn't so bad. And I have to say, when this government came in, the most right-wing, most extreme, most religious government in Israeli history, that really won the election in a way because of stupidity on behalf of the other side and not because it had a clear majority in the public. I thought to myself, maybe they will come to the task of governing a bit like I came to that synagogue a few years ago. They will try to calm down their opponents and to calm down the world, because there's been a lot of concern since the election about the far right reaching power in Israel and Netanyahu being beholden to his extremist allies. And you saw a little bit that before the government was formed, Netanyahu gave several interviews in the American media, and they tried to say, I will have my hands on the wheel, I will be the one calling the shots, not my extremist partners. But when the government came in, they immediately did the opposite. Right out of the gate, they put forward this very controversial and really earthquake-like plan to weaken the judiciary in Israel. This was presented 5 days after the government was formed by Justice Minister Yariv Levin, a politician from Netanyahu's party, Likud, and he's been a long-standing opponent of the judicial system in Israel, and he presented a very extreme plan for what they called judicial reform. Now, here I want to say something that's important. There are many people in the political system in Israel, in the media, in the world of think tanks, and even in the legal system itself, who believe that there is a need for judicial reform in Israel, that perhaps there is a way and there should be a plan to redraw the balance of powers between the authorities in Israel, to set more clear boundaries to the Israeli Supreme Court, to find a way, in the absence of a written constitution, which Israel does not have, to create a basic law that will make some sense and create some boundaries between the authorities. Judicial reform by itself is not, in my opinion, any kind of blasphemy, and no system in Israel is immune from criticism and the need for reform. But the plan that Justice Minister Levin presented 5 days after the government was formed, in the eyes of many Israelis, and I include myself, is not a plan for judicial reform. It's a plan for shattering the judiciary and basically subordinating it to the political system, which is a completely different ballgame. And if you look at the elements of this plan that he presented, and I will discuss them in a second, each and every one of them perhaps could have been moderated and changed in a way that would not create such strong backlash. I'll give you one example. There is the issue of what we call the override clause, which I think in a lot of the coverage in the United States has attracted most of the criticism and the concern. Basically giving the Knesset the ability to override decisions by the Supreme Court. So, for example, if a majority in the Knesset legislated, put forward a law that discriminates against women or against LGBT Israelis or against Arab citizens of Israel, tomorrow morning the Supreme Court could strike down that law, and the override clause would then give the majority in the Knesset the ability to overrule the Supreme Court's decision and to say, okay, we understand the Supreme Court strike down this legislation because it discriminates against women or LGBT or Arabs, but we still want to do it despite the discrimination. We're okay with it. And Yariv Levin wanted to have the smallest possible majority in the Knesset, 61 members out of 120, to have the power to override Supreme Court decisions. That is a very extreme idea. There have been suggestions over the years in Israel to have an override clause of, for example, 80 members of Knesset. 80 is basically 2/3 of the Knesset, okay? It's a bit like the veto override that you have in the United States, right? Where you need 2/3 in both houses of Congress to override a presidential veto. Other people have put the number at 70. 70 is usually a significant majority in the Israeli Knesset, and usually to get to 70 votes, you need support from the government and also from the opposition, right? If you think about this Netanyahu government, they have 64 seats in the Knesset. So if they needed 70 to override a Supreme Court decision, they would need to find 6 members of Knesset from the opposition who will vote with them for an override, which is complicated in Israeli politics. But 61 is the smallest bare bones majority, and it would give basically unlimited power to the government. And remember, in Israel, the government also controls the parliamentary majority in the Knesset. So the Supreme Court, in a way, is the only real check on the government having too much power and doing all kinds of dangerous things. And so to give 61 members of Knesset the ability to override is a very extreme idea. Another issue had to do with the selection and appointment of judges and Supreme Court justices in Israel. Today in Israel, we have a committee that is responsible for all judicial appointments, from the transportation laws court that deals with traffic violations, all the way to the Supreme Court. In this committee, there is a mix of politicians, sitting judges, and members of the lawyers' bar. This committee is far from perfect and has been under a lot of public criticism in recent years because of all kinds of deals, backroom dealings and alleged corruption that took place within the committee. And there is definitely a case, in my opinion, to reform it and to change the way this committee is composed and the way it works. But instead of presenting a reasonable and moderate and cautious reform to this committee, what the Netanyahu government suggested is basically to give the government an automatic majority on the committee and let the government basically choose all the judges. Netanyahu, in a very manipulative and cynical way, has compared this to judicial appointments in the United States. He said, well, what's the problem? In America, the president puts forward the candidates for the Supreme Court and the Senate votes on them. I will say a few things about that comparison. First of all, in your Senate, often there is a majority for the party that is the opposite from the one holding the White House. It's quite a common situation. So the president, by definition, does not automatically have a majority to pass any judge or justice that he or she wants to appoint. On top of that, senators in the United States are much more independent creatures than members of the Israeli Knesset. Every senator, at the end of the day, is elected by the voters in their specific state. And we have seen cases over the years, even with the crazy partisanship that you guys have had in the US for more than a decade now, we have seen rare cases where senators from the Republican or Democratic Party will give the president a hard time on certain judicial nominations because they, while they have their party affiliation, they also need to get reelected in their state. And there are considerations that go beyond the loyalty to your party. And in Israel, that does not really exist. Members of the Knesset do not get chosen directly by the public. They get appointed by certain circles within their party. In some parties, there is a democratic election for party members, so you have to be a registered member, but it's a very small pool of voters. In other parties, it's just appointments by the chairman or some committee that the chairman controls. And so politicians in Israeli Knesset are much less independent than your senators, and the likelihood that they would vote for unqualified judges or Supreme Court justices just because that's the party line is significantly higher. And the last bit I want to say about that, the process in the US basically goes through the entire Senate. Every senator is on the record voting for or against every judicial nominee. But what the government here in Israel wants to do, the Netanyahu government, is not to bring every justice and judge to a vote before the entire Knesset. They want to keep the committee. They still want to have it in a committee. They just want to give a majority on the committee to their own representatives. And who would the government appoint to represent it on the Judicial Appointments Committee? Would it be the Mitt Romneys and Susan Collinses and other, versions of more moderate politicians of Israel? Probably not. They would probably appoint the Marjorie Taylor Greens of Israel, the most extreme, partisan, and loyal to the leadership members, to make sure that the committee does whatever the prime minister wants to do with judicial appointments. And so what we would have is basically completely politicized judiciary that is beholden to the government, chosen by the government. And this opens the door to very dangerous situations where you would have unqualified and partisan people sitting on the court. Now, again, I'm not making the argument that today's arrangement is perfect. And I don't think the Supreme Court in Israel or any other institution is immune from criticism. And there is place to consider different reforms. In fact, Netanyahu often, when he gives interviews these days, only to the American media, he doesn't talk to the Israeli media anymore. He often says that some of his opponents in the Israeli opposition have also expressed support in the past for judicial reform. And he's right. If you look at politicians like Yair Lapid and Gideon Sa'ar and others in the Israeli opposition, they have made their proposals in the past for judicial reform, but it's very different from what his government has pushed through so far. It's much more moderate, calculated, and cautious steps, and it actually reforms that have been suggested by other governments before have to do with the real problems of the Israeli judicial system. For example, the length of trials that go on for years, or the lack of enough judges in the different courts, not the Supreme Court necessarily, but in the lower levels of the court system, you need to appoint more judges so you can have faster consideration of cases. There are problems in the public prosecution, problems within the police that need reform. But the issue of judicial reform, if you basically make it about giving unlimited power to the government, which is what this plan suggests, that's when you run into the brick wall of hundreds of thousands of Israelis who see this as a threat to democracy, as really an attempt to give unlimited power to the government, and are willing to go out to the streets to fight it. And so once this plan was first presented in early January, you immediately saw a very, very strong reaction coming from large segments of the Israeli public, and the demonstrations began to roll. It's been 17 weeks now. Think about it. That's more than 4 months, 17 weeks in a row that you've had every Saturday, tens of thousands at first, and then hundreds of thousands of Israelis go out to the streets to demonstrate against this plan and to warn the government not to pass it. These demonstrations take place all over the country, and I have to say they are very different than, within them in different locations. You have the largest demonstration that takes place every weekend in Tel Aviv on Kaplan Street. If you know a little bit, Tel Aviv, next to the Azrieli Towers, where you've had on, a week Saturday, there is 100,000 people. A regular is 150, and you've also had 200,000 on some occasions. In Jerusalem, you have a smaller demonstration, usually between 10 to 20,000 people in front of the residence of President Herzog, but it's a very different crowd. The Jerusalem demonstration, you will see a lot of moderate religious Israelis. Some of them define themselves as right-wingers, but they don't want this kind of plan that gives unlimited power to the government. And then you have demonstrations in Haifa every weekend. Some of them have had 30 and 40,000 people attending. And you have much smaller demonstrations in the area of Israel where I live, on the border with Gaza. There's a demonstration every Saturday. My wife goes out to each one of them. You see the Israeli flag behind me. That's her demonstration flag. She's a regular. And it's a crowd of a few hundreds of people from communities on the border with Gaza. And they came out to demonstrate even when there were weekends, when there was rocket fire toward our communities, and fighting between Israel and Hamas. They did not stop to go out and protest. So again, very diverse, very different in each location, but one message persists. We don't want this bad and dangerous legislation. Some people rule out any kind of judicial reform. I would say they are a minority within the protest movement. Other people, and I think that's actually the majority view, say, okay, we're ready to consider some ideas, but not these extreme and dangerous ideas. And it's been continuing, as I said, for 17 weeks. I don't see it slowing down, I have to say. Now, the most important moment of that protest movement was just over a month ago, on March 26th. And what was happening is that in the lead up to that evening, we were heading toward the final vote in the Knesset over the judicial appointments piece of the entire plan, which I think is the most important, because if the government has the power to unilaterally choose the judges, it doesn't even need all the other components of the plan. It can just take over the Supreme Court with its own appointments very quickly and have a loyal court, and then maybe you don't even need the overrule, for example. And it's important to note, in Israel, unlike in the United States, Supreme Court justices are not lifetime appointments. They must retire by the age of 70. That's the law. So in the United States, usually a lucky president will get to appoint maybe 3 Supreme Court justices, right? I think that's what Donald Trump had, 3 Supreme Court justices in his one term. And I think Biden so far has appointed 1 Supreme Court justice. Because the justices, they're lifetime appointments. So unless somebody dies or retires, there is no nomination. But in Israel, because there is the requirement to retire at the age of 70, a government that has a little bit of luck can within 2 years appoint half the court if enough judges reach retirement age. And people in Israel get this. They understand the stakes. And so as the government was moving along toward a final vote on the judicial appointments component, the demonstration got stronger and stronger. And you also had a phenomenon that was very worrying for the government of hundreds of reservists in the Israeli military, combat pilots, people from special units, special forces, people from leading intelligence units, and also from other parts of the military, come forward and say, we signed a contract with the state of Israel to serve and sometimes risk our lives because it's a Jewish democratic country that we believe in and want to protect. We did not sign a contract with a dictatorship, and we will not continue to serve in a country that is not a liberal democracy. And this was spreading through the military. And at some point, the defense minister of Israel, Yoav Gallant, who's a member of Netanyahu's party, came out and said, I think we need to stop the legislation because this is tearing apart the military. And he was seeing reports about basically entire units, especially in the reserve forces, that were being torn apart by this issue, by the controversy. And there was a real risk to the abilities of the Air Force to carry out its missions and of the special forces. And he said, we have to stop. He did not come out against the legislation. He did not say, let's cancel it. He said, let's put it on hold for a second and try to sit down and talk and have negotiations. And even before he did that, the president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, said several times that he's inviting both sides for dialogue and presented his own compromise plan, which I think actually was a reasonable plan, I have to say. But it was rejected by the government. And we heard President Biden in the United States call on Netanyahu to seek compromise and dialogue. And many other friends of Israel in the world came with the same message. But when his defense minister said those words, let's put this on hold, it's dangerous for the military, let's sit down and talk, Netanyahu decided to fire him, to fire Yoav Gallant, who is really one of the only ministers in his government that is seen by most of the public as professional and responsible and knows what he's doing because he's himself a former general who served for many years in the military. Many of the ministers in Netanyahu's government have no background at all in what they are supposed to be responsible for. That's not very rare by itself, by the way. Many times in Israeli politics, the ministers are politicians without a lot of background in their ministries. But in this government, I think there are some special cases that are creating some unease in the public. For example, the Minister of National Security, basically the police minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, he has a lot of experience. He was indicted and investigated by the police and the other authorities in Israel dozens of times throughout his life on all kinds of connections to far right and even some terror groups. So Yoav Gallant, really the one minister that if you look at public opinion polls had the trust and the support of a majority of Israelis, he was fired by Netanyahu. That happened on a Sunday night, like today, just a regular night in Israel, and it was, I think, around 9 p.m. when the message came out that he was being fired. By 10 p.m., you had thousands of people out in the streets demonstrating, spontaneous demonstrations that were all organized via WhatsApp groups, text messages, people writing, we have to do something, this is crazy. By 11 p.m., it was tens of thousands. By midnight, it was close to 500,000 people in the streets of Israel, in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, in Haifa, in Beersheba, all over the country, including, again, in my little corner of Israel on the Gaza border. There was a nightly demonstration with 200 people came out to one of the main junctions. The entire country, it was an incredible sight to see. I can tell you, I was at home covering it, writing about it, editing stories, and I was getting dozens of phone calls from media outlets all over the world, in the US, in England, in Australia, people asking to understand what's happening in Israel. What are these crazy pictures? People were blocking the main roads. And the next morning, basically, Netanyahu took a decision to accept the advice of his defense minister, for which he was fired the night before, and put the legislation on hold. Now, it's important to understand, putting the legislation on hold gives the government still the ability to renew this legislation basically within 1 day's notice. Okay, it was stopped at a moment when it's already passed 2 readings in the Knesset, and it needs to go up for a final and decisive vote. And whenever the government wants to do that, it will have to give basically a 1-day notice, and it can put it up for a vote. This means that the danger is still very real. It's been more than a month since Netanyahu put it on hold. And while I think, this month we still saw the protests against it continuing, and we saw the international reaction continuing, including some very sharp words from President Biden, who said he will not invite Netanyahu to the White House as long as this controversy is going on. There is also pressure building up from the other side, and that's something which is important to notice. Last week, there was a large demonstration in Jerusalem by people who support this legislation, most of them from the religious national community in Israel, basically voters of the religious Zionism party in Netanyahu's coalition. And they brought out a very impressive crowd as well. I think close to 200,000 people were out there demonstrating in favor of the legislation. And they were pressuring Netanyahu, telling him, we want this legislation. It's important to understand what this split in Israeli politics is really about. We see clearly in public opinion polling that most of the public is against this plan. And actually, the government has been collapsing in public opinion polls ever since this plan was presented. It's losing a lot of support. But there is a sizable minority that supports it. And you can really see it's not 100%, but a clear connection between levels of religiosity and support for this plan. This plan is being pushed by Netanyahu's Likud and by the religious parties in Netanyahu's coalition. And there are different interests at play here. For Netanyahu himself, there is a very clear interest to see this plan approved because he is a criminal defendant, right? He has his own criminal trial in the Jerusalem District Court. The state of Israel indicted him on charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. And for him, it could be very useful to choose the next set of justices for the Israeli Supreme Court. Because no matter what happens in his trial, whether he's acquitted or found guilty, there will be an appeal to the Israeli Supreme Court. And once there's an appeal, there's going to be a panel of justices in the Supreme Court who will hear the case. How convenient will it be if those justices are basically chosen by the Likud party? But for the religious parties in Netanyahu's coalition, whether it's the far right or the ultra-Orthodox, there is a different issue here. It's not about the Netanyahu trial for them. It's about their view of the Supreme Court as a liberalizing force in Israeli politics. A lot of the progress that Israel has achieved over the past decades, and that we Israelis are so proud of when we speak about Israel to the world, okay, and especially to the United States. We talk about Israel being the most gay-friendly country in the Middle East, and the advancement of women's rights in Israel, and equality for minorities. A lot of that was reached through landmark decisions of the Israeli Supreme Court, not by legislation in the Knesset. Because usually in the Knesset, whoever is in power relies on at least one of the religious parties for a government. And it's very difficult to pass legislation in favor of women's rights or LGBT rights with that kind of political arrangement. But a lot of the progress that has happened came through the Supreme Court. And the religious parties, for that reason, view the Supreme Court as an obstacle to their vision of Israel. They want a more religious Israel, less tolerant Israel, an Israel that is more connected to the values of the Torah and the Talmud than to the modern state that you will see on the streets of Tel Aviv and Haifa when you visit our country. And so for them, it's been a dream of generations to weaken the Supreme Court. But until this government took power, they never really had the partners to do it, because Benjamin Netanyahu, if you go back 5 and 10 years ago, you will see videos of him giving interviews praising the Israeli Supreme Court, explaining how important the Supreme Court is to Israeli democracy and how great it is for Israel to have such an independent and strong court, and promising that as long as he is prime minister, he will protect the Supreme Court from all kinds of ideas that are being generated within the right-wing religious circles to weaken the court. And so the religious parties and some elements within Likud had this dream to weaken the court, but they did not have a partner for it. Netanyahu was against it. Now suddenly he's flipped, and we have to ask ourselves, why? What happened? And I think it's impossible to detach that from his own criminal trial. So what's next? That's basically the situation, right? We have a coalition of people who have a very strong interest to pass this legislation. We have very strong opposition to it from large segments of the Israeli public, and also very important warnings about the impact this will have on the Israeli economy. And we've heard about large Israeli tech companies that have moved all of their funds out of the country, billions and billions of dollars, because they're afraid of a government with unlimited power in its hands. And we saw Moody's, an important credit rating agency, downgrade Israel's credit outlook because of this plan. And we keep hearing warnings from the Bank of Israel and from the Israeli commercial banks that this is dangerous for the economy. And we're seeing the protest within the ranks of the reserve forces in the military, people who are saying we will not serve under such a government. And on the other hand, we're starting to see strong mobilization in the religious public in favor of this plan. And again, not everyone. We are also seeing religious people demonstrating against it in Jerusalem and other places, but there is definitely a split here that is mostly built on levels of religiosity. My prediction, forecast, however you call it, is that as long as the pressure against this legislation in the streets and also in the hallways of power in Washington and elsewhere, in countries that are supportive of Israel will continue, there is a low likelihood that Netanyahu will actually turn on the switch and bring back the original legislation as it was passed already in the preliminary readings in the Knesset. The main danger is that the pressure will go down, that the demonstration will slowly dissipate, that people in Washington and elsewhere will lose interest, that Netanyahu will make everyone go to sleep because there's this ongoing dialogue as we speak at the president's residence in Jerusalem, the residence of Isaac Herzog. Representatives of the different parties have been meeting there for more than a month. And today we heard a very important statement from Benny Gantz. Benny Gantz is the leader of Israel's second largest opposition party. himself a former defense minister and the military chief of staff. And he's been, at least in the public opinion polls, the big winner so far of this entire mess, because he's been projecting this moderate approach that he's in favor of judicial reform, but he's against the current legislation and there needs to be compromise. And he's getting a lot of support from disappointed Likud voters and also from people who voted last time for Yair Lapid. He's going up and up in the polls. And he said today that while the talks at the president's residence are very polite and in a good atmosphere, there has been zero progress so far toward real compromise. There hasn't been any real agreement reached. And he said, we're not going to keep going forever, because I think he's afraid, like many other people, that Netanyahu is trying to buy time and make everyone calm down and make the protest movement lose steam. And then when we're all sleeping in our beds, he will turn on the switch and within one day pass this dangerous legislation. And so I think Gantz basically wanted to say, don't sleep on this one. Don't lose focus. Keep your eyes on the prize, if you will, and remain alert, because this issue is not going away. And the pressure from the other side on Netanyahu is also important, because without these religious parties, he doesn't have a government. He will lose his majority and will lose his hold on power. But I do believe that if the pressure here in Israel, in the streets, and also very, very important, what is happening in the American Jewish community, what is happening in Congress, the approach from President Biden, if all of that will continue, I think it will be very difficult for Netanyahu to actually renew the legislation. So this is where I will stop with the presentation and open it up for questions. I see some people have sent in the chat, in the Q&A. Tal, how are we going to do it? So should I just read them? Do you want to choose? What's our procedure here?
Sure. I was thinking I can read out the questions from the
chat,
starting with the questions. I think you've already addressed a few, but either from the people who've asked on the chat or other people who want to ask questions, if you want to raise your hand, I'll turn to those next.
All right. So I'm here.
I think the first one coming from Neely is I think you talked about this government and its stability. I think that's kind of where you kicked off. Neely has asked, what do you think the chances are of this government dispersing anytime soon? How stable do you think it is?
The public opinion polls right now are so disastrous for this government that I find it hard to believe anyone in the government would want to bring it down. Because if they go to new elections right now, it looks like a catastrophe for them. I mean, they're just being wiped. Today they have 64 seats. In all the polls that have been published in the last few weeks, their range of possibilities is between 50 to 57. Basically, losing power or losing power in a humiliating way. Those are the options. Even the most right-wing pollster on Netanyahu's Fox News, Channel 14, shows them losing a huge amount of support and losing the majority. And ironically, these terrible polls actually are the glue that's keeping them together, because they don't want to all face a catastrophic election. However, there are, I think, two big challenges that threaten the stability of this government. I would say actually three, but I'll start with the two more urgent ones. First of all, they have to pass a state budget by May 29. And according to Israeli law, if they don't pass the budget in a final reading in the Knesset by the end of this month, the government automatically loses power and a new election is triggered. Passing a budget is going to be complicated, because one of the results of this judicial overhaul is that it has spooked investors in Israel. It has spooked Israelis with money, the rich people in this country. It has spooked the tech community. And a lot of money either left Israel in the last few months, or money that was supposed to come in did not arrive. And this is leading to a situation where the finance ministry is concerned that it will not have enough tax revenue to fund the budget that the government is planning to pass. And this is a budget that includes a lot of candy items, if you will, For the religious and ultra-Orthodox parties, they want billions of shekels to fund their independent education systems that are independent from the curriculum of the state, but not independent from its funding. These are schools funded by the state of Israel that don't teach math, don't teach English, don't teach science, don't teach Israeli history and civics, but they expect full and growing funding from the state. And they expect billions of shekels for other kinds of priorities that their public needs. How do you fund that when tax revenues are going down, tech investments are crashing, people are pulling money out of the country? This is a big concern for the finance ministry. And also on the far right, Itamar Ben-Gvir, the leader of the most far-right party in this coalition, he wants to create a national guard for Israel that will be under his command. That is going to cost, billions of shekels as well. Where do you bring the money from in this scenario? So the budget is going to be a big problem for this government. Of course, they can decide to just, go into debt and not cover their own expenses, but Israel has already been warned by Moody's and by Fitch and by, I don't remember who was the third credit rating agency that warned Israel that, the judicial overhaul and the makeup of the government could cause at some point a change in the credit rating or the credit outlook. So this kind of, solution could actually create bigger problems down the road and a financial crisis. And Netanyahu is already being criticized by the public, and you see it in public opinion polls as well, that his government is focusing too much attention on the judicial overhaul and paying too little attention to the cost of living and the economic issues, which are a huge concern and burden for many Israelis. The interest rates here have been going up all the time because the Bank of Israel is trying to fight inflation, and this is killing people with mortgages. I can testify myself, my home that I bought here in the kibbutz, the mortgage is going up and up, and this is a problem that hundreds of thousands of families in Israel from all kinds of different backgrounds are dealing with these days. Cost of living in other ways, everything is getting more expensive. Today, the biggest news story in the country was 10% rise in the price of milk products. So the budget is going to be a big problem. The second big problem has to do with an old issue that never goes away in Israeli politics, military service for ultra-Orthodox men. Unlike the myth of Israel being a country where everybody served in the military and the IDF being the people's army, today less than half of the eligible 18-year-olds in Israel actually joined the military. And one of the biggest controversies is the fact that the ultra-Orthodox population, men and women, is basically exempt from military service. The government needs to pass legislation that will define who is exempt from service and who must serve and why. It's a difficult issue, very controversial in Israeli society. The ultra-Orthodox parties have a certain set of expectations, what they want, basically, to give full exemption to their public. It's very unpopular in the wider Israeli public, including many voters of Likud. Likud mostly gets its support from populations that serve in the military and send their kids to serve in the military. And why should their kids serve while ultra-Orthodox should not? Just think about it in terms of I have a younger brother who's an officer now in the military. He's a doctor in the military, medical doctor in the military. Very, very proud of him. And he was, until a few months ago, in a combat role. Okay, he was a doctor for a combat unit, served in the occupied territories, did things that were dangerous, carried risk. My mom didn't sleep well at night for half a year when he was there. And this is a very common experience for Israeli mothers who have kids in combat roles in the military. And it's unfair that for some mothers, this is never going to be a problem. And so this is a very controversial issue. I don't know how they will solve it. How do you get to a place where a government that is already collapsing in public opinion can give the ultra-Orthodox parties what they demand without crashing even further. So those are two issues that threaten the stability. And the last issue is the judicial overhaul itself. Will there be a point where the far right or the ultra-Orthodox tell Netanyahu, you either pass this or we blow up the government? We're not there yet. I think they've given him some time to try to find a solution via the negotiations at the president's residence and to try to cool off the Americans and stuff like that. At some point, they may lose patience. So we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you, Amir. I do want to get to, I think, a question that came from two participants, which I think is a really important one, which is, what do we do from over here? How do we, how are the worldwide demonstrations impacting this movement? What can Jews in the diaspora do other than, in addition to attending demonstrations? If we contact our government officials, what's the ask exactly? What can we do on top of those two things?
I think the demonstrations, particularly in the United States, it's hard for me to relate to other countries because I only know the politics of two countries really in a way that I feel confident to talk about, which is the US and Israel. And even on those two, I learn new things every day, but I'm certainly not going to comment on what's happening in England or Germany, although it did have an impact when Netanyahu visited those countries and hundreds of Israelis and local Jews demonstrated against him in the streets of London and Berlin because it was reflected back home to Israel. But I will say about what's happening in the United States, I think it's very significant. And the most important issue here is the places where you find American Jews and Israeli expats joining forces and demonstrating and working together, whether it's, again, demonstrations or reaching out to members of Congress and elected officials. Now, I have to say President Biden took a very strong line on this issue. Okay, last month, he was asked, are you going to invite Netanyahu? And he just said, no. And he was asked, what do you expect him to do with this judicial thing? He said, find compromise or walk away from it. And, I think President Biden has made the protection of liberal democracy the defining theme of his presidency. This is what he ran on in 2020. If you remember, he started his campaign with Charlottesville. He said he decided to run for president when he saw far-right neo-Nazis marching in the streets and shouting, Jews will not replace us. This is what caused him to run for president. He ran on this in 2020. He ran on it again in 2022, around the midterms. This was his argument for the midterms, basically, protecting democracy. This is what is behind his commitment to Ukraine. And American support for that country, which is today, the ultimate front line of the fight against tyranny in the world. This also guides, I think, his approach to China and the legislation that he's encouraged Congress to pass that's supposed to compete with some of China's economic impacts and his commitment to Taiwan. And this has also guided his response to the events in Israel. A president who has made the defense of liberal democracy the most important issue of his presidency cannot sit on the sidelines and watch a democratic ally become the next Turkey or Hungary. That's just going to be completely contradictory to everything he stands for. But there is a question of how the Democratic Party at large will respond to President Biden's lead on this issue. Will Democrats support President Biden on this, stand with him, or will they choose this kind of wishy-washy approach of, all the classic sentences that AIPAC is now briefing members of Congress to say about this issue? Okay, I don't need to repeat them. You've all probably heard them from certain people. This is a very important question that has not yet been decided. We have seen dozens of Democratic members of Congress, many of them strong, lifelong supporters of Israel, speak out against this legislation. Some of the names, Jerry Nadler in New York and Brad Sherman in California, and many, many others, people who have stood up with Israel, and stood up for Israel and supported Israel and always been there. And now they are standing up for Israeli democracy. And if we see more and more Democrats stand with President Biden on this and express their support for democracy in Israel, it will make a difference. Whereas if it seems like President Biden is isolated within the party on this issue, and more people choose the AIPAC line, which is really a line of supporting Netanyahu. I mean, this is the argument of we don't take sides in Israeli politics. I respect it, and I understand where it's coming from. But on this specific issue, if you're treating this as business as usual, you are choosing a side. And so this is where I think the demonstrations in the US and other kinds of action and reaching out to elected officials and writing for your local newspaper and being active about this in your synagogue can still make a difference, because it will determine if President Biden's approach will become the approach of the Democratic Party at large. And of course, there are people in the Democratic Party today, a small segment of it, but still an important segment, that don't really understand what's the issue with these protests, because they have a very negative view of Israel to begin with, right? If you think Israel is not a democracy today, and your entire view of Israel is through the prism of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you may not understand even what this protest is about. But many supporters of Israel know that Israel is a flawed democracy. It's not perfect, but it's still the only democracy in the Middle East. And there is room to improve on so many issues, but it's also important to keep what we have and to protect the democracies that does exist here. And from these people who are supporters of Israel, but are also committed to the values of liberal democracy, change can definitely come. And so this is where I think the movement in the United States can have a big impact.
That's great. Thank you, Amir. I think we have time for one more question.
Yes.
And
yes.
I apologize that we're not going to be able to get to all the questions in the Q&A. But I was asked the question about one particularly scary development that we've seen recently, which is the Ben Gvir militia.
The National Guard, yeah.
Quickly?
I actually want to express a little more calm approach to this. This basically, when Netanyahu decided to halt the legislation, Ben Gvir threatened to blow apart the government. And Netanyahu, in order to keep him in the government, agreed to create this National Guard that Ben Gvir wanted to have under his command. And then everybody, including myself, was very worried that it could become a militia loyal to the most far-right minister in the Israeli government. There has been very strong pushback against that from the police, from the Attorney General of Israel. If the result of this, now there's a committee considering it for 2 months. If the result will be a private force under Ben Gvir's command, I do believe the Israeli Supreme Court will strike it down. And again, these are the kinds of issues we talk about when we talk about the importance of judicial review in Israel and the importance of an independent Supreme Court. Because if there is a reasonable and moderate plan to create a National Guard that will work within the police and will not be under the control of a specific politician, I don't believe the Supreme Court will intervene. But if this is a politicized plan that gives Itamar Ben-Gvir his own militia, I believe the Supreme Court will intervene. And this is exactly the issue. Right? A government that has unlimited power will use it for dangerous things. That's just how it is. Power corrupts, and unlimited power creates complete corruption. The Supreme Court serves as an important check on power in Israel. And this idea of creating a National Guard, you can argue if it's good or bad, and it was also suggested by previous governments. If eventually the committee that the government created will have a reasonable plan, it will stand, and some people will like it, and some people won't like it, and it won't be a complete disaster. And of course, if the government comes up with a completely unreasonable and dangerous plan that will give Itamar Ben-Gvir his own militia, we expect the Supreme Court to intervene. These are exactly the kinds of questions we talk about when we talk about the importance of an independent court that can conduct judicial review.
Amir, thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining, educating us. Tamal, if there's anything you want to say.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I just wanted to remind the people who are here that next week on Monday, we will be hosting Shikma Bressler, who is one of the prominent faces, I think, of the protest movement. She's the one who heads up, she's one of the founders of the Black Flags movement, and she MCs the Kaplan demonstrations every Saturday night and more, obviously. So it would be great to see everyone there as well. Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern time.
I just want to say, I want to thank everyone who attended. I hope this will be possible for people to also spread to their friends and communities and people who want to educate themselves. I also want to encourage everyone, if you're interested to learn more, to come read on haaretz.com, where we have all the explanations and all the information in English every day. And really, it can be a great resource for following the events and understanding what's happening. And I really want to thank Oz for inviting me today and for this opportunity to address your community.
And thank you, Amir. And we're definitely going to share the link to the recording tomorrow. Thank you again. It was great. I want to echo some of the comments. It was really easy to understand what's going on. And we hope that we're going to bring you soon to talk about the resolution of all this once it's resolved.
Amen. All right, friends. So have a great day there. Later out.